Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I must admit I'm slightly apprehensive this evening addressing a society whose mission is to protect and enhance landscapes and historic buildings. Tyne Smith has been blamed almost exclusively for blighting local landscapes and destroying buildings of interest. So my objective this evening is to perhaps present a more balanced appraisal of this man's legacy. Thomas Daniel Smith, better known as Tyne Smith, was in his time the best known politician in the UK outside of Westminster. His character and reputation have been traduced over the years and encapsulated in various sound bites. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, the entry written by Professor Norman McCord, describes him as local government leader and criminal. Tyne has also been described as one of Newcastle's most infamous sons. His entry in the Telegraph Book of Obituaries reads, "Known as Mr. Newcastle, Tyne Smith was the nearest Britain has had to a Chicago-style mayor. He controlled all the key committees on the city council, which he used to further the interest of John Poulsen, a corrupt architect and developer who was the chief client of Smith's PR firms." Are these descriptions balanced and fair, or does this quote from Shakespeare apply to Tyne? Did he become an easy target for the planning errors in Newcastle during the 1960s and 1970s after his conviction for corruption? And have his achievements been largely forgotten? Tyne was undoubtedly an exceptional character and a very able politician. He has, however, become a legend, clouded in myths. And what balanced view should be taken of this man? Well, members of the jury, let us consider the evidence. Thomas Daniel was born in May of 1915 in a ground floor flat in Holly Avenue, Wallsend. He was named after his maternal and paternal grandfathers. Thomas's father was a coal miner who drank, smoked, and gambled. He was an anti-royalist Republican and told Thomas never to stand for the national anthem. His father was a member of the Independent Labour Party and was also a Stalinist. His mother was the stronger character. She was a Christian socialist who was anti-drink, and she held down 2 cleaning jobs. Both parents held distinctly left-wing views. His mother, according to Tyne, got the best of the arguments, but the worst of the marriage. His father introduced him to opera, to Plato's Republic, to Marx, and to Robert Tressel's ragged-trousered philanthropists. Dan's father bought a piano for him and his older sister, Lucy. Lucy became an accomplished pianist, but would rebel against her father, and she moved to the Midlands to marry an ex-rugby school man. Thomas Daniel started school at Richard Dee's infant school in Wallsend in 1920, shown here second from the left in the second row from the front. From 62 to 75 Holly Avenue, and then to Portugal Place, to a house owned by Dan's father's employer, the mining company. And that house looked out onto a mortuary, a gents' toilet, and the council refuse yard. In 1926, during the miners' strike, the family lost their furniture, which was being bought on credit. Thomas was described as a lonely, sensitive boy. He needed someone to stimulate his imagination. He failed his scholarship examination. Thomas Daniel moved to Western Boys' School and Rutland Road in Wallsend. In 1929, he was chosen to make a presentation to the retiring headmaster. He left school that year, aged 14, and was taken on as an office boy at Swan Hunter, but lasted only a day. Thereafter, Dan began work as a house painter and worked for a number of decorating businesses. Between 1930 to 31, he was painter's apprentice at Ralph Moore and Sons. In 1931, he moved to Wilkinson Brothers in Orchard Street, Newcastle. That business went bust, and Tyne went to the Dole School in Jarrow thereafter. He suffered periods of unemployment during the 1930s. He took City and Guilds exams in painting and decorating. At Rutherford College, he learned about woods and marbles. He attended WEA classes on international affairs. He met his future wife, Ada Simpson, in a dance school. Dan was 20 and Ada was 16, and she lived in Heaton. They married in July of 1939, just before the outbreak of World War II. In the census of September of 1939, Dan was recorded as being a house painter living at 203 Park Road, Wallsend. In 1941, Ada and Dan rented rooms at 13 Belgrove Terrace, Spittal Tongues in Newcastle. Gradually, as people moved out, they rented more and more of the building. They eventually bought the property for a reported £600 and lived there for more than 40 years. It is a very nice property, but not exactly Millionaire's Row. In 1936, Dan had become a founder member of the Peace Pledge Union. He opposed the Second World War until after the German invasion of Russia. Both his parents were strong pacifists in the wake of the First World War. Dan initially refused to register for war service, but changed his position, registered, but was deemed unfit for service due to severe deafness in his left ear after a bout of scarlet fever. He never registered as a conscientious objector. He actively campaigned against World War II, describing it as a capitalist war. Christ would not have gone to war, he said. It was against everything he taught. Although he said that, Dan himself was not a Christian, he was more of a humanist. During this time, he was as scathing about the Labour Party as he was about the Tories. In 1944, he helped organise the Tyneside apprentices' strike over the Bevan Boys initiative, a move to conscript young men to work in the coal mines. He regularly addressed anti-war meetings at the Big Market, at Newcastle and in Newcastle and at Headley's Corner in Wallsend. He was a member of the Independent Labour Party during the war, who with 3 MPs formed a very small opposition to the wartime coalition government. In 1943, Dan was put forward as the ILP parliamentary candidate for Wallsend. In 1944, however, he was expelled from the party for being too left-wing. After expulsion, Dan declared himself a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, but in 1947, he was expelled from them too for political opportunism. He and his colleagues had, according to an inquiry, been disrupting the works of the party and not acting as loyal members. According to Dan, his activities were by now being monitored by MI5. Dan's wife gave him an ultimatum. If she was to have children, Dan would have to be a father and husband and not emulate those self-styled revolutionaries who saw marriage as a hindrance in the march towards socialism. During the war, Dan worked at John Morley Coaches and then the Co-op Coach Works on 4th Street, Newcastle. After the war, he became self-employed and set up Smith's Decorators. He won the contract to paint the Oxford galleries. The firm specialised in redecorating cinemas. Dan and Ada had 3 children, 2 shy daughters and 1 son. All of their 3 children went to private schools. All 3 children have been divorced. He joined the local Labour Party in 1949, but was not an instant success. He was elected to Newcastle City Council in 1950, and in his manifesto, Dan described himself as being a lifelong member of the Labour Party. After being elected, he served on the Libraries Committee, and then in 1952 was appointed to the Health Committee and a joint committee on slum clearance. Alderman William McKeague said it was clear Smith was destined to be a leader. He had a special quality and stood head and shoulders above the rest of the Labour group. He was a most capable debater, and obviously he was very ambitious for power. The image he promoted was of a working class intellectual. Roy Hadwin, a councillor colleague who would become Dan's right-hand man, said he was a natural leader. He made your brain work. Others were less impressed. One Tory councillor said he talked a lot of sentimental twaddle. If you want to sell yourself to the intellectuals, you've only got to have a mining background, wipe the coal dust from your face, call yourself Dan instead of Thomas, and you're home and dry. In 1958, he became housing chairman and deputy leader. He had already been chairman of the constituency City Labour Party from 1953. He went on to become leader of the council in 1960. And it is important to note, ladies and gentlemen, that this was an unpaid position. And he was still chair of the housing and planning committees. In that same year of 1960, Wilfred Burns, aged 37, became chief planning officer. He had been involved in the rebuilding of Coventry after World War II. Burns would later become chief planner at the Ministry of Housing and Local Government. He was subsequently knighted. There would be some personal tension between the 2 men. In the 1950s, 42% of occupied buildings on Tyneside were without a fixed bath, and 19% were without the exclusive use of a lavatory. In the 1960s, there were 16,000 families on the waiting list and a further 10,000 homes awaiting demolition for slum clearance. Newcastle was the 2nd largest property owning authority in the country, controlling some 34,000 out of the city's 86,000 houses. A decision was made to demolish and rebuild within the city boundaries. System-built, high-density, high-rise concrete tower blocks were preferred. This method was being encouraged by the Conservative government of the day, obsessed with boosting the number of houses built each year. Tyne's first major project was to improve Scotswood Road by clearing the slums and replacing them with high-rise flats. 10 tower blocks were built on land donated by William Cruddas. Dame Evelyn Sharp, shown here, was permanent secretary at the Ministry of Housing and Local Government. She would, in due course, be Dan's only defence witness at his Old Bailey trial. This is a poem written by Tyne at the time of the Scotswood Road improvements. From Cruddas Park to Rye Hill, we are determined, have the will. These horrid slums we shall erase with surgeon's knife and then replace. Now let us consider some of the shadier practices employed by Tyne Smith. Dan's decorating business had prospered. He set up a number of satellite companies between 1958 and 1961. Smith's decorators recorded contracts worth received contracts worth 51,000 from the city council. According to his colleague Jack Johnson, Dan came onto the council to get business for Smith's decorators, but according to Tyne, that business never provided much income. Public relations, defined as the promoting of a favourable image of an organisation, was something Tyne got involved with. In Tyne's case, his efforts in large part were aimed to promote builders and architects, not to the public, but to councillors up and down the country. Dan's accountant, Bill Kirkup, who was, interestingly, a Tory councillor, suggested that he should have a separate PR company for each of his clients. This would, in due course, make it virtually impossible for anyone to detect the whereabouts of Poulson's money. Dan's colleague, Jack Johnson, said it is easy to understand why Dan got into PR. It made it so easy to manipulate people. In 1964, one of his PR companies was hired by the Labour Party to support Harold Wilson's 1964 general election campaign in the northern constituencies. He was paid £10,000 per annum. At that election, 39 out of 50 marginal northern constituencies were won by Labour. In Newcastle, Dan advocated the Scottish building firm Crudden's behind the scenes, but would not attend any meetings where contracts were discussed. He was being paid £2,500 a year as Scarne's British agent, as well as doing PR work for Crudden's. The Tories accused him of taking money from Crudden's while steering a big contract their way. Dan suffered a heart attack during this time. Eventually, in 1963, the Crudden's contract was blocked by the Minister of Housing for being too costly, and the contract was subsequently awarded to Brims. Interestingly, Dan would end up living in one of the multi-stories built by that contract. In 1962, Tyne became associated with John Garlick Llewellyn Poulson, a devout Methodist and Freemason. He was an unqualified architect, incapable apparently of even the simplest design himself, but he excelled at cutting corners and obtaining planning permissions. Tyne was hired by Poulson for PR work, getting £800 per annum plus £1,500 expenses. According to Dan, Poulson ran the most efficient practice in Britain. The majority of councils that the firm dealt with were Labour, and their councillors were only too happy, it seems, to leave details of schemes to the personable Smith and Poulson, the bluff Yorkshireman. In June of 1963, Tyne defended in Newcastle Council the award of the Westgate Road contracts to Bovis and Poulson without declaring his own financial interest as a paid consultant to both. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a break from dodgy Dan to talk about Dan the Plan. Post-war Newcastle had suffered comparatively little war damage, but risked being left behind. A once great industrial city, it had failed to modernise itself to meet post-war realities. Its buildings in the town centre were smoke blackened, Victorian, Georgian, or even earlier. An interim city centre plan was published and presented to the council in 1961. Dan's plan was considered bigger news at the time than Yuri Gagarin's first space flight. The plan was the precursor to its ambitious successor, the 1963 Development Plan, which had 40 recommendations. Dan was very aware of the need of the region to move away from its industrial past. Education, cultural and retail quarters were included. The plan envisaged a science city to nurture the industries of the future. These would all underline Newcastle's status as the regional capital. top architects, Sir Robert Matthew, Sir Basil Spence, and Arnie Jacobson advised the council as to who should design buildings in the central area, starting with the education precinct. There was a degree of conflict of interest in this advice, as they would all receive contracts from the city council. The plan had cross-party support and was received with acclaim from academics, including Professor Napper of Newcastle University. The phrase Brasilia of the North was apparently coined not by Tyne, but by Councillor Doris Starkey at her inauguration as mayor in 1960. Brasilia, capital of Brazil, had been designed by three principal architects, including Lucio Costa, who had been schooled at the Royal Grammar School in Newcastle. Brasilia was a city planned on a grand scale using modernist architecture where traffic flowed smoothly. And the phrase reflected a bold vision of an ultra-modern city where there would be vertical separation of pedestrians from vehicles and the removal of traffic from the city centre with elevated walkways. Before the vision was implemented at all, Tyne resigned as leader of the council to become chairman of the Northern Economic Planning Council, the first step in his view towards regional government. He swapped his office in the Civic Centre for one at Wellbar House in Gallowgate. He promoted many of the plans for Newcastle's development which had a regional dimension, for example, the airport, the cleanup of the river, the rapid transit system, northern arts, and the reorganisation of local government. He quickly became disenchanted with his new role. He was demoralised by mid-1967. He had in fact given up real power on the city council for a powerless talking shop. In short, he had backed the wrong horse. Tyne was in effect a full-time chairman, though he was paid only an honorarium of £750 per annum. In 1968, Tyne became chairman of Aycliffe and Peterlee Newtown corporations, and more of that later, but he used these positions to secure work for Paulson. At the same time, the vision for Newcastle was at least in part becoming a reality. The new Civic Centre was designed by the in-house architect George Kenyon. Throughout its construction, Tyne was writing memos on the facilities to be provided. So, for example, the council chamber was to accommodate 149 members in anticipation of a provincial assembly. Why 149 members? I don't know. 149 is a prime number. The Civic Centre was built by McAlpine from 1958 and completed in November of 1969 at a cost of £4.9 million. Swan House was designed by Sir Robert Matthew, the most prominent Scottish architect of the 20th century. Swan House required a large roundabout that severed Pilgrim Street from the Tyne Bridge and is hugely out of scale with the surrounding historic buildings, principally the Holy Jesus Hospital. Swan House contributed to the decline of Pilgrim Street and led to the demolition of the Royal Arcade. The 1963 Buchanan Report was very influential for planners in the 1960s. That report promoted urban motorways and pedestrian walkways. It was a reaction to a massive jump in car ownership in the 1950s from 2 million vehicles to 9 million. Newcastle was to be the Venice of the North, with motorways instead of canals. Outline plans were to remove through traffic from Newcastle's city centre via east and west central motorways, of which only the east was built, and then only in a reduced form. The central motorway did at least largely solve the problem of north to southbound traffic travelling through the city centre. The A1 had run up Pilgrim Street and Northumberland Street until 1967. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard a little about Dodgy Dan and Dan the Plan, but what was Dan the man like? Well, he was over 6 feet tall and imposing. He was blessed with great charm and knew how to use it. He was respected and admired by many of his colleagues. He was a very animated speaker, always gesticulating with his hands. He was described as having an intimidating physical presence and a booming voice, possibly due to his deafness, which didn't brook argument. He could apparently rule a committee room with a rod of iron, and he could strike the fear of God into City Hall officials. He could be charming or intimidating to suit his purpose. He did not seem to have many friends on the council. He wrote, "In my life as a councillor, I was in a personal sense friendless. I had no part in the social life of the council." In truth, he appears to have been a somewhat complex personality. He wrote, "I am 6 or 9 people, and it changes from hour to hour and from day to day. And some days I am well, and some days I am not. So I am not setting myself up that for 24 hours a day, I am either a saint or a sinner." Well, make of that what you will. The Tory leader, Arthur Gray, said he wore his hair long at the back and looked like an enthusiastic SS officer. He had the ability to tell a flagrant lie without blinking an eyelid. It was his Trotskyite training. He had learned that if a lie helped achieve a purpose, then you lied. Michael Pickering of the Evening Chronicle said, "He began to believe in his own publicity. That's what happened to Dan. Let's face it, he was made by the media." Roy Hadwin said he was like Barnum, always full of show, and you just wanted to believe it. Well, let us now turn to the series of criminal trials that Dan had to endure. He was charged in January of 1970 that he corruptly offered to Alderman Spall, being a member of a public body, Wandsworth Council, emoluments for him to show favour or forbearing to show disfavour to Fleet Press Services or other companies with which T. Dan Smith was connected. After being charged, Dan gave up all of his public positions. His absence precipitated a major slowdown in progress in Peterlee, where IBM, largely due to his influence, had decided to set up a science centre. The science park would never be built. Dan's first trial was held at the Old Bailey. The jury was out for no more than 45 minutes, and he was acquitted and awarded costs of £10,000, almost all of which went to his barrister. It had taken 18 months for him to be brought to trial and acquitted. Alderman Sidney Spall went to prison for accepting a bribe from T. Dan, which apparently he had not made. Superintendent Mees later accepted that if Spall had declared an interest, T. Dan would not have been the subject of a charge. A debt of only £1,300 forced architect Poulsen into bankruptcy. His meticulous record keeping would prove to be his undoing. Poulsen's former associates, including T. Dan, tried to settle Poulsen's debts to stop public hearings. They raised £130,000, but were still unsuccessful. Dan, by this time, was broke and in debt to a number of people. The second criminal charge related to Poulsen contracts at Peterlee. At Dan's instigation, Poulsen had been hired as consultant architect on the Arts and Humanities Centre in Peterlee. According to T. Dan, he was advised by his barrister, David Saville QC to plead guilty. Tyne was by this time drinking heavily, taking Valium, and had money problems. He was also being hounded by the press. He was said to be living on 6 bottles of Carlsberg Special Brew per day. He was also being treated for ischemic heart disease and bladder problems. He asked the court to take into consideration 3 other offences involving corruption of which he had not been indicted but wanted to admit. He was legally aided at his 1974 trial, an indication of how little money he now had. Dan met David Taylor, a BBC reporter, for a documentary, The World of Tyne Smith. In that documentary, he admitted his own guilt to bribing Alderman Cunningham. He was asked whether he deserved to be sent to prison. He replied, "Within the law, I say yes. I think I have offended and I deserve to suffer." His legal team advised him to expect a 6-month sentence. He was given 6 years. In total, 21 people were sent to prison. Tyne always saw himself as a fall guy, high profile, but not part of the establishment. More senior figures, including Reginald Maudling, worked for Poulson's companies and promoted him in Parliament. Maudling was found to have breached parliamentary rules. He resigned as Home Secretary in July of 1972. I wonder, ladies and gentlemen, whether at the time there was a prevailing culture in both local and national politics that almost encouraged corruption. Many building contractors had councillors on their payroll acting as site agents and local government advisors. PR lobbies were active in Westminster from the 1950s. Some MPs were prepared to trade their independence for a fee. I'm tempted to say, ladies and gentlemen, some things never change. Tyne seems to have been resentful that although dealing with budgets amounting to millions of pounds, he received no remuneration. This does not excuse his actions, but perhaps allows a better understanding of how, in his position, he might have succumbed to temptation and how easy it would have been to slide into corruption. Tyne was advised not to appeal and served 3 years in prison. He had a rather harsh introduction to jail, being assaulted and robbed, but thereafter adjusted to prison life. 2 years were spent in an open prison at Layhill, which is in Gloucestershire, and Dan became the life and soul of the prison. And this more relaxed way of life became, he said, like a heaven-sent gift to lift the veils of ignorance. He famously encouraged the convicted murderer, Leslie Grantham, to take up acting. Grantham later made his name as Dirty Den in EastEnders. Dan stood for president of the Layhill's Prisoners' Council. He was defeated by a homosexual headmaster whose campaign slogan was "Up with the bummer and down with the briber." In 1976, Tyne was charged with fraud offences relating to Dilson Electronics. Dan had moved to live in Northampton in 1971, where he worked for the firm which became insolvent in April 1973. Now a serving prisoner, Tyne said from the dock, "This is not a prosecution, it is a persecution." And he was cleared on the judge's direction. Dan was turned down in his first parole application in April of 1976. His second application was approved and he was released halfway through his sentence on the 1st of March, 1977. By now, he had been involved in 9 years of police questioning. He now felt the world could no longer hurt him. After prison, Dan worked for the Howard League for Penal Reform, championing rights of released prisoners. He set up the New Directions Employment Project for ex-offenders. In 1978, the local Labour Party refused to readmit him to membership, relenting only in 1987. Dan was a humbled man who continued to deny his guilt and claimed to have done his best for Newcastle. Financial difficulties forced the sale of his home in Belgrove Terrace in 1983, and the Smiths moved a short distance to take up a council tenancy in Mill House in Spittal Tongues. Dan's health deteriorated, but even so, up to the time of his death, he continued to write and actively campaigned for what he believed in. He died in 1993, aged 78, during an operation following a heart attack. His funeral at the West Road Crematorium was attended by over 300 people, including many politicians and senior officers from the council. He was survived by his wife and 3 children. Ada, his wife, died in 2018, aged 99. Both sets of ashes were scattered in the Lake Districts. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, a brief evaluation of this enigma's achievements and also of his failures. In terms of achievements, he created the country's first independent planning department, planning previously having been done by the engineers department. A new civic centre was built in Newcastle. A meeting was set up in 1966 to establish a 9-member team of traffic experts to establish an integrated transport system to increase bus and rail usage. Newcastle was the first city in Britain to clear all of its slums. The 28-storey Vale House in Shieldfield at 262 feet was for a long time the tallest building in Newcastle. It is now the 2nd tallest. It won a national award for good design and was regarded as one of the best of Newcastle's post-war council blocks. The city plan included 2 distinct educational areas, the university to the north and the educational precinct to the east. But for his personal intervention in securing the necessary land in the heart of the city, much of the development of higher education facilities would have been much further afield. He received an honorary degree from Newcastle University in 1967. Dr. Miller, Dean of Medicine, said, Dan Smith has planned construction rather than destruction, and his unceasing and unselfish activities over the past decade have been devoted to banishing forever the spectre of economic depression from Tyneside and building here a regional civilization of unique and genuine character. Interesting words, are they not, when you consider what eventually happened. Dan promoted arts and culture. He loved classical music. He played the piano, wrote poetry, and painted. He proposed a cultural quarter to include a new library and a museum. He promoted the installation of contemporary art in the new civic centre, calling it the People's Art Gallery. He championed regional government. This was not, strictly speaking, an achievement, but I have included it because of his vision in this regard. He sat on the Redcliffe Maud Royal Commission into local government reform. A government white paper of 1970 did not recommend elected regional assemblies, as T. Dan Smith had long advocated, which would have linked Tyne, Tees and Wear regions. He was a passionate advocate of a united Tyneside and a democratic regional assembly. He also envisaged provisional representatives to form a second chamber to replace the House of Lords. Perhaps if that had been implemented, there might be less disaffection in some parts of the United Kingdom, particularly one thinks of Scotland. He reorganised councils in 1963. A policy committee was set up, which is effectively a cabinet, and this has been adopted by almost every local authority in the country. Frank Harris was appointed chief executive in 1965 from his post of accountant and manager at Ford Motor Company. Harris managed to reduce the number of committees on the council from 37 to 11. 6 councils combined to take over and develop a small airfield into a major international airport at Newcastle. This demonstrated, in Tyne's view, the potential of the region to act as a region, even though there was not regional government. Tyne persuaded 18 local authorities to help clean up the River Tyne, including county, borough, district, rural and parish authorities. Interceptor sewers and huge treatment works at Howden began. A 10-year investment plan began in 1970. I just wonder, ladies and gentlemen, how much of the rejuvenation of Newcastle's quayside is due to the cleanup of the River Tyne. It has been a significant factor, I would suggest. Dan also wanted to develop St James's Park into a football and athletic stadium. He said Newcastle United pursue a love-hate relationship with their fans. The football team has never matched the passion of the supporters because the club is run by businessmen who act as a dictatorship and think they are above democracy. Again, I'm tempted to say some things never change. Well, let's look at some of his failures. The project of slum clearance necessitated 100,000 people being moved away from their home locations, for example, to Benton and to Killingworth. And did these distant high-rise blocks destroy those local communities? Well, destroying communities seems to have been the intention of Newcastle's chief planner, Wilf Burns, who said that it is surely our task to break up such groupings, even though the people seem to be satisfied with their miserable environments and seem to enjoy an extrovert social life. The biker wall perhaps was the exception, designed to keep communities intact, and it is regarded as a masterpiece and is now Grade 2 listed, designed by Ralph Erskine, appointed in 1969 by the then Conservatives who were back in control of the city. Tyne said at the time, the Tories got the showcase that we created, and I had inherited the wreckage that they created. The Burns-Smith vision was ultimately over-ambitious. Priorities changed in the 1970s. The golden age of the car was coming to an end. But by this time, Tyne was long gone. So attaching personal blame strikes me as being rather unfair. Stylistic criticisms, such as the modernist principle of dynamic contrasts, i.e. the juxtaposition of old and new architecture, exemplified at Mere House, these criticisms are not without merit. But again, this was not Tyne's doing. He accepted advice from leading architects. And this next item is, I think, of fundamental importance to this evaluation. Tyne probably exaggerated his input to the vision. He claims to have done an initial sketch, but as he said, he surrounded himself with people of greater intellect and better education than himself. Planning was not his personal responsibility. Wilf Burns created the vision. Signature architects were employed to deliver it. One of Tyne Smith's greatest mistakes was to suggest that he was more responsible for the vision than he actually was. As a result, he has borne more blame for planning mistakes than is strictly justified. In short, in my opinion, Tyne Smith has been blamed too much, and the so-called signature architects have been blamed too little. It has become fashionable to condemn the Smith-Burns developments, and the principal controversies have been over Eldon Square and the Royal Arcade. Old Eldon Square was planned by Richard Granger and designed by Thomas Oliver and John Dobson, built between 1825 and 1831. There were houses on three sides of a communal garden, but by the 1960s, many of those fine buildings had fallen into disrepair. According to John Pendlebury of Newcastle University, much of the controversy over Eldon Square was generated some time after its fate had already been sealed. There was a strong planning case made for the development of shopping facilities in the city, which at the time had the public's support. The original plan of building a high-end shopping centre with a multi-storey hotel, that design was dropped in 1971. The revised plan resulted in an unattractive, brick-built, introverted project, but Eldon Square Shopping Centre is still one of the UK's top 10 shopping destinations and is 40% owned by Newcastle City Council. The Royal Arcade was designed by John Dobson, built by Richard Granger in 1832. A beautiful building with handsome vaulted ceiling with 8 glass domes. It had shops, offices, banks, a post office, steam and vapour baths, and was possibly the finest shopping mall in the country, but it was not a financial success. It was in the wrong part of town. Competition from Grey Street and Granger Street saw it in decline by the 1870s. The main post office moved to St. Nicholas Street, and by the 1890s, it was filled with second-hand shops. It was dismantled in 1966 to allow for Swan House and the adjacent roundabout to be built. Each stone was numbered with the intention of rebuilding it elsewhere. That never happened. There was no money and no alternative location. So, was Tyne Smith unfairly blamed for some things? Some concrete monstrosities were not Tyne's fault. For example, Westgate House, shown here, that was not built until 1975, 10 years after Tyne had left being leader of the council. Noble Street flats on Scotswood Road were used in Peter Flannery's 1996 drama, Our Friends in the North, but these flats were planned by the Tory Liberal administration in the 1950s, and Tyne said they were an indictment of the council that allowed them to be built and of the professionals who designed them. In the BAFTA-winning series, Our Friends in the North, Tyne Smith was the model for corrupt local politician Austin Donoghue, played by the wonderful Alan Armstrong. In trying to modernise the city centre, redevelopment was, to some extent, prioritised at the expense of heritage. 56 listed buildings were demolished. Even so, many fine buildings remained. Both Burns and Smith seem to have had a genuine interest in preserving what they regarded as the best of the historic building stock. Historic preservation was part of the planning strategy and the subject of a specific report, March 1962. Tyne Smith took steps to preserve the town wall and to regenerate its towers and surrounds. He stopped a modernist bank proposed for Grey Street. Similarly with Alderman Fenwick's house, St. John's Church and the Guildhall. Blackfriars, Brunswick Church and Holy Jesus Hospital were also saved to a degree. There were preservation areas included in the city centre plan with special reference to Granger's town centre, the Cathedral Castle area, St. John's area and the Guildhall area. Many people have tried to determine whether Tyne was a scapegoat or a crook. a victim of an MI5 setup, or someone who was seduced by corruption. The jury, to a degree, is still out, although I personally feel that suggestions about scapegoating and an MI5 plot are both smokescreens thought up by Tyne in prison. In 1987, Murray Martin and Steve Trafford of Amber Films made a documentary about Tyne Smith. Murray seems to have admired Dan, while Steve thought he was a smooth talker, always dodging, ducking and diving, who wanted to rewrite history. Dan's replies to questions were long, unstructured, and moved from topic to topic in a way that was almost a stream of consciousness. This is what Dan's personal secretary said: "I never saw any signs of ill-gotten gains, riches, or extravagant expenditure. Dan did not behave like a man who had a great deal of money. He certainly never gave the impression of being intent on building a personal fortune. I felt Dan Smith was a good man, and I still think that now, that he was a good man, but he did make mistakes, and not necessarily honest mistakes." Jack Johnson, political colleague in the Independent Labour Party and on the City Council, he fell out with Tyne after the Cruddens affair and said Dan forgot all about his socialist roots. He was only for Dan. The visionary work was there to raise finance for Dan's PR work, not the other way around. Jack Ramsey, the Evening Chronicle correspondent, wrote, "I always regarded Dan Smith as a man of integrity who was dazzled by the expensive lifestyles of some of the people he dealt with. He genuinely felt he was a man who should be paid for the important work he was doing. But having said that, he was not a man looking for a huge financial reward." Jeremy Beecham, former leader of Newcastle City Council, said, "I have been a leader for 3 times as long as Tyne Smith, and I wouldn't claim to have achieved a tenth of his achievements." Tyne Smith was one of the outstanding local government figures. This is what Dan's son said. "Only his family knew the real Tyne Smith. I am proud to have had him as my father. He was an exceptional man who loved and believed passionately in the North East and its people. He fought for them both." And this is what Tyne wrote in his autobiography. "Long after I'm dead, perhaps somebody will write a couple of lines and say that people of the Northeast were slightly better off for what I did, no matter if I did some things wrong. Things that I did right will prove to have more value than any harm that was done by Poulsen getting a few jobs he would not have had if I had not operated." Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm at the end now. The definitive biography of Tyne Smith has yet to be written. On the basis of the information that I have garnered from a variety of sources, I have concluded that Tyne Smith was corrupt and also a corrupter of others. He was surrounded by people who were well rewarded for their work, and Dan thought it was only fair that he received adequate recompense for his endeavours, and this acted as some form of self-justification for his malfeasance. I do not believe that financial gain was his primary motivation, but its lure seduced him into criminality. Having said that, I cannot help but admire this dynamic and complex man. He was undoubtedly a gifted communicator and an innovator. His passion to improve the area was, I believe, genuine, and despite his serious personal shortcomings and strategic failures, he achieved a great deal in a relatively short period of time. And there is something magnificent about the scale of the ambition Tyne Smith had for the Northeast. And in my humble opinion, no other Northeast-based local politician comes close to Tyne Smith in terms of charisma, political vision, and achievement. Thanks very much for your attention, Stop sharing my screen now.